The Philadelphia Eagles head into Tampa for the third time in the past two seasons after a big victory over the Saints. Meanwhile, the Buccaneers are reeling after a 19-point loss to the Broncos with a rookie quarterback. The Eagles are currently 1.5-point favorites and feel like they should win this, but with a lot of major injuries and bad recent history against this team, there's a lot of questions. Welcome to the Philly Film Room podcast. Along with my co host, Eric Sidewater, I'm Nick Waters, and today we're going to be discussing all things Buccaneers and Eagles. But before we get to that, Eric, there were some fans that were giving you a lot of shit about you saying that you weren't sure who the Saints wide receiver 3 was. Are you sure? Were you able to figure out who the Saints wide receiver 3 was after last week's game?
Who dat? That's all I gotta say to those Saints fans. I believe Tipton ended up with one target, which he did not catch. And yeah, I don't even think A.T. Perry was dressed. So I feel pretty good about that one.
You know, I did see Tipton. I think he got blown up by former New Orleans Saint Zach Bond. So that was good to see. What were your overall thoughts of the game? Did you have any takeaways after that big victory?
Yeah, well, if people remember, I was talking about how I'd like to see more five-man fronts, especially against these outside zone teams, and they employed that, and it was effective, way more effective than I could have ever anticipated. I was actually kind of shocked, and Fangio committed to this specific personnel groups. I mean, Huff only had 18 snaps, and it was the right decision. And another thing that surprised me is that they had so many one-on-ones with Cesar Ruiz blocking Jalen Carter, which basically prevented all their play action plays from even developing properly. So we don't even know necessarily how the coverage would have ended up working out because how many plays he foiled. So I think we'll learn more about that this upcoming week. But yeah, defensively, what a masterclass by Fangio. On the offensive side, I was impressed by how they moved the ball. I mean, I think they had like the most yards on offense of any team in the NFL. They just didn't put points on the board. Red zone struggles. That is something that is news around the entire NFL. People talk about, look at the trend in NFL. Mel Kiper banned too high defenses, all this crazy stuff. And I think a large part of this can be distilled down to these red zone defenses have really tightened up. They have a lot more smart coverage calls that they're going, not allowing them to get anything easy. And that's really put a damper on some of these offenses. And just as you see scoring go down, though, I think field goal attempts is like skyrocketing. So that's going to be something that's relevant every week, in my opinion, especially in this upcoming game against the Bucs, which, for foreshadowing, I am predicting another low-scoring game. So we'll see how that materializes.
Yeah, and is that red zone stuff just variance, or is it a long-term trend that we're going to see play out? And I think red zone defense is going to be huge in this game, especially seeing that the Bucs have one of the best red zone threats ever in NFL history in Mike Evans. So it's something that we're going to need to pay attention to. And maybe an episode about red zone defense is coming up. That would be something to pay attention to. It's something that's really helped the Eagles defense really stay afloat through much of this year. Now, looking into this matchup, we have to look at this Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense. They are now led by new offense coordinator, second-time NFL offensive coordinator Liam Cohen. It's quarterbacked by Baker Mayfield, headlined by receivers Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, both of who are former All-Pros. Mike Evans, likely a future Hall of Famer. Tristan Wirfs anchors the left side of their offensive line. He at one point at least was a highest paid offensive lineman. That might have changed since August with how quickly those go up. But they currently rank 15th in points per game, 26th in yards per game, and 18th in EPA per play. So, Eric, what did you see from this Buccaneers offense on the film?
It was really vanilla. And I was a little disappointed because you have this guy who was like coaching with the Rams, coaching in college, so you're expecting a little pizzazz. and I just didn't see it. Every now and again, they had some really cool concepts that they pull out of the bag, and you'd be like, "Oh wow, like that's this is like a up and coming offensive coordinator who's got some nice gadget plays." But it's really their staple, their base plays down to down. It's just extremely vanilla. It as opposed to what we saw with like Packers or Saints. This is not a high octane offense. And I don't necessarily think they're doing anything that exotic scheme wise to generate explosives. There's a lot of true dropbacks out of shotgun. There's a ton of inside runs, like inside zone, throw in some gap scheme runs in there. They're not running a lot of like under center wide stuff like we saw with the Saints. So for people who are saying, oh, I wonder if the Eagles are going to run with these 5 and 6 man fronts again, I would say not as likely. I think probably they'll employ them more than they did in the first 2 weeks, but not as much as they did in the Saints. A lot of intermediate passing concepts from the Bucs. I mention that because, Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, you mentioned it, both all pros, great receivers, not a lot of downfield juice, especially Mike Evans. It seems like he's a little hampered, maybe with a little knee injury. Obviously, he's aging. So, yeah, he's still a great receiver, but are you worried about him taking the top off? I would say not quite as much. A last thing I'll mention is this is something we did see a ton in the first couple of weeks, which is condensed splits. They're even under center or shotgun, their receivers are playing pretty tight to the line of scrimmage. A lot of quick passes out of that. I can guarantee you we'll see shotgun, condensed split, and then they just hit a little speed out trying to win the leverage battle against our corners. They do that every week, multiple times. So if you're talking like a 3rd and 7 and it's like just a race to the sideline, I think we'll see stuff like that. These Baker likes to play on time. And they like to get it in their running backs' hands. Quick dump off screen plays. Both their running backs, will get into them, are probably better as like receiving backs than they are true under center running backs. And so you don't want to give them that easy stuff. That's mostly what I saw from the Bucs scheme. How about for you?
Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head, especially talking about what we've seen from the offenses in the first couple or 3 weeks of the season, and then watching this Bucs offense on film, and it's just not as much eye candy. Like you said, it's very vanilla. They motion, and if you look at this offense compared to a 2015 offense, then it's, state of the art. But when you look at where they're at, maybe they're going to continue to add more variety to their offense as they continue to grow, because this is a new offensive coordinator. Maybe they add as they continue to grow. But right now, seeing what we saw from the other teams earlier in the season, there's not as much confusion, or there's not as much motion and stuff that's distracting your second level defenders, especially the linebackers. So I think they're going to be well prepared, much better prepared than they were the first few weeks of the season. Or you could tell they just weren't fitting runs correctly, or there was some hesitation where their gap would open up, or their gap that they would need to fit would present itself, but like Zach Bond would hesitate and not fill downhill, right? Those opportunities, I think that the Eagles defense gets more efficient. They get more quicker. They just become a little bit better at filling gaps, at executing their assignments as they get more comfortable. And knowing that we've already faced teams that are much more complex than what this Bucs offense has shown so far this season, I think this really sets up well for the Eagles defense. And then you look at the fact that, like you said, they don't run nearly as much outside zone as what the Eagles saw. And that's really what they're getting beat up on, especially against the Falcons. All those runs that they were giving up, almost every single one of them was an outside zone run. We're not going to see as much of that from the Falcons, from the Bucs. Although if they sit in certain fronts, then the Buccaneers will run outside zone. So we'll see how Fangio tries to play that. Well, it's going to be something we'll touch back on after the game. But you did touch on as well. It's a lot more drop back passing game. They were 10th in percentage of passes that were non-play action passes. So way less play action passes than we saw in weeks prior. They were 23rd in pressure rate allowed. So you can take advantage of this offensive line when you get them into drop back passing situations. I feel like this is a situation where our defensive line can finally feast and not have to sit there and constantly worry about everything else that's going on. So I think this is a week where we can really start to see that line take advantage, much like we saw last week when we got the Saints into longer down and distance scenarios. So I'm excited for this game to see how this defense responds. I think something we do need to note, and you touched on it, I don't think we see as much base personnel. I don't think we see as much 5 down fronts this week because we're not seeing as much 21 personnel from the opposing offense. They get into 12 personnel, and that's where they get a lot of their runs from, especially under center. So you might see some base personnel when they get into 12 personnel. But the question mark is, how's this defense play against 11 personnel? How's the run defense against 11 personnel? What fronts does Fangio come out in? Is he staying in his 4 down fronts, or is he going to his 5 down fronts when they come out in 11 personnel? Because that's what they're getting gashed on. And if they stay out in those 4 down fronts, do they execute their assignments better? Because in my eyes, that was the biggest issue, was their executions of the technique. So can they correct? Can we see the corrections made this week once they face more 11 personnel? Now, Eric, did you have any thoughts on the game plan and things that the Eagles could do to slow down this Buccaneers passing attack, or offense in general, excuse me?
Yeah, the number one thing I would say is I expect that the Eagles will be able to get the Bucs in a fair share of 3rd and medium, 3rd and longs. You gotta key in on Chris Godwin. This guy's getting targeted at an astronomical rate, especially in these situations. I would pretty much bracket him every single time on 3rd down. They don't have enough weapons outside of him. Obviously, Mike Evans is a great receiver. I don't think they really have enough weapons outside of him where you're gonna struggle if just because you're devoting an extra guy for Godwin. Maybe you could bracket him and Evans on 3rd down. And the other thing I would say is don't allow them to just rack up a bunch of easy completions to their running backs for big yards. Baker will be pretty quick to his check down at times to the running back. They will throw screens, as we talked about. They have some good receiving backs. These are just like the offensive coordinator pushing the easy button, and if you're not vigilant, they can gash you. They're not going to have sustained, continued success on offense throughout the game without some gimmicky stuff like that. I just don't think they're set up to operate like that. So how do you do that? Well, you dedicate, like, you just have your linebackers play like pretty aggressively in the flats on these running backs. Maybe if you're running a 5-man front, you can drop the edge to the side of the running back to kind of take away some of the passes to the flats. I think both of those things could be effective. How about for you?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about taking away their outside zone. They will run outside zone, especially outside zone to the weak side, if you give them an open B gap bubble to that side of the field. So essentially what I would do is I would run under fronts. That's going to put a defensive tackle in that weak side bubble. And what that essentially does, and what they've shown on film, is when they see a lot of under fronts, they transition and start running a lot more gap scheme runs. So things like power, counter, duo. I think the Eagles defense is much better built to take advantage of that and stop those type of runs. So running under fronts, especially against when they come out in 12 personnel and we match with base, I think running under fronts will be a benefit to this defense, and I think that's something that we should do. When they are in their nickel package, they're gonna probably stick in their over front a lot. And if people don't really know what I'm talking about, I released a video a couple days ago, actually the day of the Eagles Saints game, that talked a lot about their fronts that they use. So check that out. When they are in their over front, though, they're gonna have the weak side B gap open, so it's gonna encourage these outside zone runs to the weak side. So what have they done to take that away since that Falcons game? Have they improved their technique so they can call their base plays and just run this with base play calls, or can you do some things to lay some traps by running stunts, right, where you spike your defensive end into the B gap, and a lot of times you can get tackles for loss or force the run to spill outside to a linebacker that is now oftentimes unblocked, right? So doing different things like that. I personally would run cover 8 to whatever side. I would cap Mike Evans' side. So what that's going to do is put a safety over top of him on the deep side, over top of him on his side of the field. And then also there's going to be a flat defender underneath him. I would cap him because of a lot of what you're saying. Chris Godwin's getting a lot of his throws very short and underneath. I think his average depth of target is 6.5 yards. That's 77th out of 91 qualifying receivers in the NFL. So for that reason, at least on longer down and distance situations, I would run a lot of cover 8 to cap Evans because he's more of the deep vertical threat. And then there's still coverage underneath for Godwin's to have to run through. So that's specifically what I do. Also, one more thing. In the red zone, you have to watch out for Evans. He has 3 targets in the red zone. That's most on the team. He actually has 3 targets in the end zone. All of his targets have been end zone targets. So I'd try and bracket him in some way. He is a red zone savant. He's an end zone jump ball savant. And not just jump balls, right? He has a multiple different ways that he wins in the red zone. So try and bracket him in different ways. Some things the Eagles do is they'll play cover 1 and they'll take their post safety because there's no deep post to cover. Is they'll use him and they'll bracket the number 1, or they'll bracket a specific receiver. A lot of times this time they might pick Evans. And then that way, what will happen is if he, say for instance, Evans runs an in-breaking route, let's say a slant, then the safety will take and nail down on the slant, and then the corner will zone off and still play in zone coverage. So they kind of bracket and then replace the coverage. So just different ways that you can handle stuff like that. So that's just making sure we take away Evans and the red zone, especially the low red zone, is something that we'll need to pay attention to. Now, jumping to some of their players in specific and guys we got to really hone in on and touch on is looking at quarterback Baker Mayfield. We've played this team twice last year, so I think a lot of people have seen Baker Mayfield and kind of know who he is. To me, he's kind of like the playmaker versus point guard kind of debate where a point guard is a guy that's going to get the ball out quick where it's got to go, but isn't probably going to hit too many 3-pointers or make too many splashy plays. Whereas Baker, I feel like, is a guy that he can get the ball out quick if he wants, but he's a guy that really wants to hit big plays, extend plays, take shots down the field. He's a guy that can put the ball in trouble and throw the ball into tight spaces as well, right? So I think for that reason, he puts the ball up for grabs. And he did that multiple times throughout the season. He's 8th in turnover-worthy throw percentage. I think he struggles with post-snap processing. So there's chances where he gives the ball. There's times where he gives the ball away. He's currently 5th, his second lowest in average depth of target at 5.5 yards per throw, and his adjusted completion percentage is second best as a result. But again, it's a lot of underneath stuff right now, and I think you touched on it with their weapons. So while Baker can hurt you and you do need to make sure you keep him in the pocket, he will give you opportunities for takeaways. But Eric, what's your thoughts on Baker Mayfield?
Yeah, you just made me think of it. It's like I bet you Mayfield would be itching for one of these speed demon deep threats like Jamison Williams or Shaheed, because he is wired like that to want to take the big play, and he can deliver. I mean, he's got a pretty big arm, but like you mentioned, they're not set up to be able to keep making explosive plays consistently with those weapons. One thing I'll mention that kind of stuck out to me watching the film is he's pretty good at scrambling. Specifically, like just escaping the pocket to both sides. So he'll roll and spin out to the left or escape to the right, or straight up the middle. He just finds pockets of space to escape, and he is pretty wiggly, much more than you'd expect from someone like of his athletic profile. So you got to be vigilant about him. Now, what I noticed is the Broncos, they were extremely successful running the pass rush against him I think they might have had 7 sacks last week. And they really did a great job of converging from both sides and collapsing the pocket. if you just have someone shoot up the gut or one edge, he's getting away from that most times. So I hope that the Eagles have good pass rush integrity, like when as lane integrity, so that they don't let him escape because he'll punish you. And you mentioned it, penchant for making bad throws specifically because he wants to make big plays and he's post snap processing leaves something to be desired. He'll just throw late in the traffic. So all that to say, I do predict he'll throw an interception, maybe two.
Yeah, I really wouldn't be surprised if he tossed us one. Or let's see, maybe Quinyon Mitchell finally gets his first interception. Now, looking at running backs, they have two that are going to be in play, Rashad White and Bucky Irving. I'll touch on Irving first. He might not play. He had a hamstring injury. He was limited Wednesday. He downgraded to did not practice on Thursday, so that's not a good sign. He is more their change of pace back, although I'd say both their backs are probably more change of pace backs, to be honest. But he's an undersized but shifty and elusive back. He's got very good foot quickness. He has 6.2 yards per carry, and you'd think, why isn't this guy getting the ball more? Why isn't he the lead back? If you look at him on film, a lot of his best runs are coming off of gadget plays, reverse and arounds, jet sweeps, stuff like that. He's not really making guys miss a lot on standard runs. He is undersized, like 190 pounds. Even corners, safeties, they're bringing him down in open space when he should be making these guys miss, when good running backs are paid to make these guys miss. Their starting running back, Rashad White, I would say he's had mostly an underwhelming career. I would say there's some infrastructure issues behind it, but he hasn't helped himself. His career high in yards per carry is 3.7 in any season. He's currently averaging 2.1 yards per carry. I think the Eagles should be able to stop this Buccaneers rushing attack. I don't think we should see what was happening with the Falcons. Completely different rushing attacks. He is an all-around talent. He has the size, athletic ability, and receiving back to be an every down back, but he just hasn't been that running back that you would hope for. I really do think he's best as a change of pace back or a third down back, and he can make you pay in the passing game. But again, I think the Eagles can contain these guys on the ground. K. Dotton is a guy you need to watch out for as well. He's a tight end for them. He is involved in their passing game. He is fourth and actually he might be third. He's third or fourth with Rashad White and receptions this year, but he's a solid receiving tight end. And actually thought he was a solid run blocker. So he's someone that will make plays. You'll hear his name on Sunday as well. Tristan Wirfs at left tackle. He's a premier left tackle. He was the highest paid offensive lineman at one point in time. Josh Sweat will be going against him for the most part. I don't think Sweat's going to have a huge game, but looking at what should probably be a weekly segment is the weekly question: who is blocking Jalen Carter? And this week it is Cody Malk, who I don't think is going to have too much success against Jalen Carter. We'll see what the Buccaneers do in this matchup. The Falcons and the Saints both said we're going to see if Jalen Carter can, if we can hold up against Jalen Carter one-on-one and our pass protection. And for the Falcons, it worked out. For the Saints, it did not. I don't think that will work out for the Buccaneers. So we'll see if they have a different game plan. But Eric, what do you think about this matchup? Do you think that Malk has any chance against Jalen Carter?
No, and if they leave him one-on-one, it's coaching malpractice. The Saints did it probably because they saw the Falcons had success, but the Saints had a Cesar Ruiz, the Falcons had Chris Lindstrom. So that was a huge mistake by them, and they didn't really adjust. I feel pretty confident they're going to slide to Jalen's side, especially because then they have Wirfs one-on-one against Sweat on the other side. So it just seems a lot more intuitive that way. Now, here's the thing. If they do, that's still Graham Barton, rookie, and Malk. So Carter could beat that double team. A little idiosyncrasy I noticed was Graham Barton doesn't wear gloves, which I found very odd. I wonder how many centers in the NFL don't wear gloves. And then, so yeah, I feel great about that matchup. If they have to devote extra attention, okay, then you have your weak side, or you have your D tackle on the other side who has a potentially favorable one-on-one. And my bold prediction for the game, Bryce Huff gets on the stat sheet with his first career sack. So I'm optimistic about the Eagles' defensive line for this matchup.
Yeah, well, for Huff, he should have more opportunities. He definitely saw a reduction in snaps just based on the game style that they were going to play last week. So facing a team who's going to be passing more, most likely he should see more snaps again. So we shall see. Now, if they're sliding the line his side, does make it a little bit more difficult. And especially on film, they were chipping on that side quite a bit, although that was because they had their starting right tackle who was out. It's looking like he's going to play, but that's something to keep an eye on. Now, talking about to Malcolm and detail, I thought he has issues overextending, reaching and getting over his toes. And I thought he had issues with set point, so making sure he's keeping good leverage with the pass rusher and not getting either too far outside or staying too far inside and giving him the outside path to the quarterback. I thought he had issues with that. And if you have issues with both of those, like we saw against the Saints, Jalen Carter is going to make you pay, especially with his inside club that is his go-to move, right? So we'll see. Like you said, I think we're going to see them slide the line to Jalen Carter. For that reason, I think we should start to see some of those twists and those pressures from Fangio that we haven't seen as much as we have been expecting, mainly because we haven't really seen him face a true drop back passing team or a team that is as committed to drop back passing. So if we do see more attention to Jalen Carter, then that should open up those times when we see some of these pick stunts. And then on the opposite side of that, do we see some twists in some games to attack with Josh Sweat and whoever's rushing on that side? Do we see some twists with those guys to help? Eric, do you have any thoughts on this side of the ball before we switch over and look at the Buccaneers defense? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, a little peek behind the curtains. The first couple weeks, I would be messaging Nick during the game, where are the pick stunts at? And this kind of is a good explanation of you don't just run them blindly. It has to be appropriate. And I do think that we will see more of that this week. If you look at the Eagles' stunt percentage this year, it's lower than Fangio has historically ranked league-wide. So there will definitely be some reversion to the mean is my expectation.
Yeah. Those stunts it's just a tool, right? You're not going to use a wrench when you need a hammer. So it's just a tool. We'll see when there's times to use it. We'll see it more so again. But now switching to the other side of the ball, looking at this Buccaneers defense, it is led by Todd Bowles. Eagles fans are probably pretty familiar with him. He is entering his 5th year as a defensive coordinator and also the 3rd year as a Buccaneers head coach. This defense is headlined by names like Levante David, Vita Vea, and Antoine Winfield Jr. They rank 16th in points per game, 27th in yards per game, and 11th in EPA per play. This is an interesting matchup as Jalen Hurts has faced Todd Bowles 4 times now. He is 1-3 with all those losses being pretty ugly for the most part. And with an offseason of searching for answers to the blitz, including calling Wink Martindale for answers, we'll see if Jalen Hurts has taken the next step to elevate his game. So, Eric, what did you see from this Buccaneers defense, and can the Eagles offense overcome, especially considering they're likely to be playing without a number of key players?
Yeah, and I do wonder how much this is small sample size, because as opposed to previous years, it looks like Bowles is embracing a little bit more of this bend but don't break philosophy. As you mentioned, they're giving up close to the most yards in the NFL, but they've at times have had very stingy red zone D. In fact, against Detroit, who had 7 red zone appearances and I think scored once, 1 touchdown on those, which was one of the it's like a historical performance for red zone defense. Now, that might be a little bit different, but they still love to bring pressure, especially on obvious passing downs, whether it's simulated pressures, fire zones with 5 man and a zone behind it, or cover 0 and they're bringing 6 or 7. They're running all types of these pressures. They blitz at the 2nd highest rate in the NFL. This is shaping up, in my opinion, to be one of the highest blitz rate games in the entire season. I could see Bowles blitzing on 75% of obvious passing downs, and that's not hyperbole. He's going to send the house consistently, and he's going to say, look, the Eagles have none of their top receivers out there. They probably feel good if they're going to match Levante David or Dennis on Goddard and make them beat them over the top. So I'm very curious to see how this materializes. We've said this repeatedly, that one of the reasons Kellen Moore presumably got the job is because he impressed them in the interviews about his pressure plan. So we're going to get to see what that really looks like, in the small sample size in the first 3 weeks, because the Eagles haven't been blitzed maybe as much as we may have expected. We're going to get to see it this week. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this game really boils down to me. I think the biggest storyline in this game is going to be Jalen Hurts versus Todd Bowles. Jalen Hurts versus the blitz. And Kellen Moore versus Todd Bowles. Because ultimately, Kellen Moore was brought in here because the Eagles couldn't get over the hump in the playoffs against teams like the Buccaneers, against coaches like Todd Bowles, and his blitz-heavy approach. He manipulated. It was not just the Eagles and Jalen with their protection issues. It was also the offensive line. They weren't picking up the protections properly as well. So the protections were getting manipulated. There wasn't hots built in. Jalen wasn't comfortable, right? So this game will tell us how far that Jalen has come, how far the Eagles have come, and really, is this going to be an issue for the rest of the season? So this is something to really watch out for, and I think you hit the nail on the head. Now, touching on some of their other some of the other complexities of their defense, they run a ton of cover 3. They don't play a lot of man coverage. They really only play it if you get them into short yardage situations. But outside of that, a ton of cover 3. But it's not like they're just sitting there and rotating into the same cover 3 look the entire game. They run several different variations. So a lot of times they'll switch up whether they're rotating strong or rotating weak. So which side is the safety rotating down to? They'll rotate him to the flat, or they'll rotate him to the hook zone. Right? So they're just changing up the looks. All of these variations just change little differences in where the weaknesses of the defense are and change things up a little bit, right? They'll run creeper pressures as well. They'll run cover 3 with blitzes in front of it, and they'll play 4 under 3 deep. They'll play 3 under 3 deep coverages. So they'll change it up. And then they'll often pair it with quarters coverage to overlap with some of the weaknesses. For example, and they play a lot of spot drop cover 3 zone, which is different than what you typically see in today's day and age, right? So, for instance, why you would pair quarters with this style of cover 3 would be very weak in the seams if you play this style of spot drop cover 3. So, 4 verticals often stresses cover 3. So by pairing cover 4 with it, you can give offenses a look that takes away the weakness of your primary coverage, right? So it's just a changeup. That's all it is, right? That's essentially all it is. So they do enough, especially with their blitzing as well, and their vast amount of blitz looks, and just changing up their coverages and the variations enough to constantly keep you guessing. And it really helps them become a defense that's greater than the sum of their parts. So that's really the overall look at the defense from my end. But Eric, what are your thoughts on what the Eagles can do to move the ball against this defense?
Yeah, and you mentioned it. Having a robust pressure plan, going into there with multiple options at their disposal, sight adjustments, where at the line of scrimmage, you're adjusting your route if you're expecting pressure. Peak rule, where if the guy who's over you blitzes, now you're turning around instantly and trying to catch it close to the line of scrimmage and in stride. Quick hitters, screen passes, and you will have to test them deep. You mentioned 4 verticals as a way to expose cover 3. They can run cover 3 shells behind blitz looks. Now, the question is, do the Eagles have the personnel to test them deep? My guess is rather than seeing huge bombs like 40, 50 air yards, it's going to be more like 20 yards down the seam, a bullet pass, and you catch it in stride. That's more likely. Avoiding turnovers, as always. It's kind of been amazing that we've been able to win a couple games here without winning the turnover battle. And establishing a consistent interior run game. We've talked about this now several times. The best unit on the Eagles is the offensive line. And now you have Saquon Barkley running behind it. And he's showing things he didn't show with the Giants. You mentioned it. Better vision at times. More explosiveness. So, Vita Vea, if he's not playing, now you have a really good chance of destroying them in the middle. So I'm eyeing that closely to see what his status is. Those are all things that I think will be successful. I'll throw in one little nugget for Eagles fans. You mentioned like creeper sim pressures. Everyone has seen this double mug look where the linebackers will come right in the A gaps, so they'll have 6 man on the line. Now, pretty much across the league, what I've seen, when teams drop out of that, the 2 inside linebackers will start to gain a lot of width or move towards the sidelines as they drop backs to kind of take away the seams. But I've seen the Tampa has this little wrinkle where their guys will drop straight back into traditional hook zones. So if you're trying to run a dig, which is just like a 10 or 15 yard in breaker, which is pretty effective against those sim pressures where they drop back and gain width, and then as they're going this way, you just come behind them. That could be dangerous for the Eagles because they run it a little differently. So those are kind of the things that I think the Eagles should be planning on doing.
Yeah, I think part of your protection plan can be boiled down to staying ahead of the sticks. So I think that is a great way to take away the blitz packages or to mitigate them to some degree, because Bulls will get into these blitz packages on, let's say, 3rd and 4, where he'll walk everyone up to the line of scrimmage, walk his linebackers up directly on the line of scrimmage. But in those situations, when we saw it last year, the Eagles last year would just run right at it. And in their first matchup, in their week 3 matchup last year, they would run right at it, right? But you have to stay in, let's say, a 3rd and 5 range to be able to do that stuff. You can't be doing that on 3rd and 9, or you shouldn't be. I mean, Nick Sirianni will, but that's a different. That's a different story. But staying ahead of the sticks so you don't have to deal with these pressure packages, because they are diverse and they are robust and they have different answers built on top of them, right? So even like a lot of people will say things like when you face cover 0, just run a slant. That's all you got to do. Well, defensive coordinators are smart and they know that offenses will just run a slant. So what do? They read your offensive line, and if they'll take a couple players, and if they see the slide of the offensive line, if the offensive line slides towards you, you drop into coverage. So now you're wasting those guys in pass protection. And where are you dropping? You're dropping into the areas of the quick throw areas, right? The Patriots did this a lot. Brian Flores did this a lot, right? He killed Lamar Jackson with this play, right? So they have these answers. The Buccaneers do stuff like this. This is why you have to have different answers. You can't just have one answer. You have to have a robust package. But part of the package can be staying ahead of the sticks. How can the Eagles do that? Number 1, commit to the run early and stick to it. And that means running on 2nd down too, not just 1st down. I'm not saying run it on 1st down every time. You can't become that predictable. But make sure you commit to the run and not get into the 2nd quarter and have situations where Saquon Barkley hasn't touched the ball. Secondly, use Saquon and Goddard on early down pass game, quick game, screens, right? Different types of screens as Saquon. Screens in the perimeter, bubble screens, swing screens out of the backfield, standard traditional running back screens. Can you scheme up 2 or 3 of those in the game to keep yourself ahead of the sticks? Same thing with Goddard. We've seen Goddard handle those dump off tight end screens. Saquon on option routes against their weak linebacker. He'll have the opportunity, one-on-one opportunities against their linebackers. What about Goddard on those arrow routes to the flat where we see him on a play action fake where they're running that split zone, play action fake, Goddard leaks out to the flat. Stuff like that to keep yourself ahead of the sticks. That's what I would do. And then ultimately, don't get greedy. If you get to second and long, stay conservative unless the shot is there, right? But don't force it. Get yourself back to a situation where you're in third and medium. So then if you want to then run the ball at their mug blitz look to get yourself into fourth and short, you have that opportunity. But you can't stay in third and long against this team, right? So that's what I do. You'd mentioned some things about their protection. I would also just change their protections up. You can't stay in the same standard drop back 3-5 step protections. Different like play action protections where you get full flow one way and you're rolling out the other way, or split flow protection where your offensive line slides one way, your tight end blocks back the end man of the line of scrimmage one way, or your gap scheme protections where it looks like you're pulling an offensive lineman and running a gap scheme run, but you're just changing up their protection looks. Just do stuff like that. Last thing I will say about this, I know I've gone long. Make sure Goddard split out on third down, especially looking at our injuries and knowing that it looks like AJ and Devontae aren't going to play. With Bull's his blitz package, he often forces you to keep either a running back or a tight end, or oftentimes both, into protection. So if you're going to do that, that would force Goddard into protection if he stays in line. For that reason, line him out on the slot or out wide so you can keep him out as a threat. Because once you start to look at past Jahan Dotson, it's Paris Campbell. We're bringing back John Ross. It's not looking good there. But moving on to defensive matchups, Eric, I'll took a lot of time there, so I'll throw the floor over to you. I know you love this guy, Levante David. What'd you think about him on tape?
Yeah, he's still good. I think you're finally starting to see Father Time catch up to him a little bit. If I had to guess, this is probably his last year. But, he's the quarterback of their defense. He's still playing, like his IQ is up there with any player, a defensive player in the NFL, in my opinion. So yeah, he's a tremendous piece. But like I said, he's slowing down a little bit. I think sideline to sideline, you're starting to see that he's lost half a step. So you may have success with some of those quick hitters that you mentioned, swing screens and the like. Previously, he might blow those up by himself. And one other player that really stuck out to me is Zion McCollum, brother of Eagles, Tristan McCollum. This guy was maligned by Bucs fans in previous years. He's a young player, but he's really starting to put it together. You mentioned it in previous podcasts. Both of these brothers have tremendous athletic profiles, amongst the best athletes in the NFL. And now he's starting to put some polish on that athleticism and frame, and he looks like he could materialize into one of these top end corners. So I'm excited to see his development. But as you mentioned, the Eagles wide receiver one going into next week is Jahan Dotson. So if he's going against McCollum, that doesn't bode well. Dean is another guy on the other side who's a solid corner. So I'm probably going to try to target other areas, other defense. Who stood out to you?
Yeah, well, I'll touch on McCollum real quick. Listen, this guy is a guy that he's the prototype. He's like made in a lab type prospect, height, weight, speed type prospect. He's only allowed 4 receptions on 12 targets this year for 52 yards. He has an interception, I think 3 pass breakups. I mean, just insane numbers to start the year. This is what happens when you give elite athletes an opportunity to grow. They don't always pan out, but whenever they do and they hit, you get guys like Zion McCollum. You're right. I would not test this guy either, especially with the weapons that we're likely to be rolling out there. We do need to talk about a couple players, especially on their front. Regarding injury, Kalijah Cansey is by far their best pass rusher on their team, but he has not practiced at the time of this recording 2 practices in a row. Usually that doesn't look like you're going to play. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and assume he's not going to play. Vita Vea, Eagles fans will likely know who this guy is. He has terrorized Jason Kelsey in the past. He is a mammoth of a human being. He didn't play in week 3 and was limited so far in practice this week. So we'll see. It looks like he is going to play. But he'll be a real test for Cam Jurgens, who I think has looked really good so far, but he is going to be a test for Cam. He'll also be a test for Mekhi Becton, especially with him playing through a hand injury. Is his grip strength going to be affected? I'm sure it certainly will. So something to pay attention to injury-wise. Outside of those guys, their defensive line really isn't that great, and they don't get a ton of pressure. So this is part of the reason why Bowles has to blitz so much. And not to mention, they stunt at a very high rate too. So you have to be prepared for that. But he can't sit there and rush with 4 and play spot drop zone coverage, or he's going to get torn up. He has to blitz. So if the Eagles can keep themselves in situations where Bowles is less likely to blitz, that's going to be the best thing for them. Final player I want to talk about, Antoine Winfield Jr. Many people consider him the best safety in the NFL. He's an all-pro. Did not practice second day in a row. He didn't play last week, so that's something to watch out for as well. But he is looking like he's not going to play. Any final thoughts, Eric, on these guys or this Buccaneers team before we get to score predictions?
The pass rush was non-existent. We're gonna see plays where Hurts, and we saw it in the first couple of weeks. He's back there for 6 seconds, just scanning the field, trying to find someone. The Eagles need to get better at the scramble drill. There's so many opportunities where he has an eternity, sometimes even against 4-man rush plays. These are plays where you could start getting 25, 30-yard gains if you really hone in on the scramble drill. We'll have plenty of opportunities like that. Bo Nix was able to get time and then scramble and run for yardage kind of at will. By the way, the Broncos, even though they started off rough in the season, they really looked good last week on film. We'll see if that was just a mirage. But yeah, I mean, I think Jalen can punish them on his feet. And like I said, if he'll have several plays with lots of time, so hopefully he can find people.
Yeah. I think Jalen's going to end up being, especially using his legs, is going to be a vital part of this game plan. Looking at the fact that they just don't have a lot of weapons to use, they're probably going to have to lean on the running game, including Saquon, including some of the other backs, and including Jalen, and then really funnel a lot of the targets through Goddard and through Saquon. Hopefully, some guys can step up, hit a big play here or there from Dotson. Maybe Calcaterra can hit a big play here or there. He's done it in the past, right? You kind of go unnoticed on a little route underneath, and then you turn up the field for 20 yards. We'll see what happens. But Eric, let's put this all together and wrap it up. Give me a score prediction. What do you think's going to happen?
Forewarning, Eagles fans, I do not think it will be a fun game to watch. Eagles have 1 million injuries. Bucks have 1 million injuries. Bowles has had lots of success against Hurts. But I have Eagles in a narrow victory, 17-14 down in Raymond James Stadium, taking us to 3-1. What's your prediction?
Yeah, so I think offensively, I think the offense can move the ball at times, but being down AJ and Devontae, we're likely going to see a drop in rate of explosive plays. I think the offense is likely forced into a heavy rush attack and a quick to intermediate passing game, and with long drives, more likely to sputter with backup receivers in the game. Defensively, I think the offensive game plan helps to shorten the game and keep your defense off the field and keep the clock running. But I think the defense can stop the Buccaneers' rushing attack and put them into longer down and distances. And I think they can then get pressure on this offensive line. And again, Baker will give you the ball, especially if you start to pressure him. So for that reason, I think the Eagles score 4 times, 2 touchdowns, 2 field goals. Buccaneers score 3 times, 2 touchdowns, 1 field goal. Eagles win 2017. That's it. That's all we got for this week. So make sure to tune in as we, of course, review this game after. But until then, like, subscribe, and until next time, go Birds.